What you are about to realize in the next 15 seconds is that the world you believe you are living in is not the world as it actually exists, but a carefully constructed mental simulation created by your brain, because at no point do you ever directly experience reality itself. Only the interpretation your mind generates based on limited sensory input, past memories, emotional conditioning, and unconscious expectations that quietly shape everything you see, feel, and believe. The most unsettling truth is that your brain does not exist to show you the truth, because truth is inefficient and survival is not, meaning your perception is optimized not for accuracy, but for usefulness, safety, and prediction, which explains why two people can experience the same event and walk away with entirely different realities that feel equally real to each of them. What you call reality is actually a prediction machine at work, because your brain is constantly guessing what is about to happen next based on past patterns, then filling in gaps before you are even aware of them, creating the illusion that you are reacting to the world when in fact you are responding to expectations formed long before the moment arrives. Your senses do not deliver raw information to your mind, because they send incomplete, fragmented signals that your brain must assemble into something coherent. And during this assembly process, assumptions, biases, emotional states, and memories are injected automatically, meaning what you perceive is already filtered before you have a chance to think about it. This is why fear sharpens certain details, why anxiety amplifies threats, why sadness dulls color and motivation, and why confidence makes obstacles seem smaller, because your emotional state directly alters the version of reality your brain constructs, changing not only how you feel, but what you literally notice and ignore. What makes this even more dangerous is that your brain hides this process from you, because if you were constantly aware that your perception was a guess rather than a fact, you would hesitate too much to function. So instead, your mind presents its interpretation as certainty, creating the feeling that this is just how things are. The brain's need for certainty is so strong that it will invent explanations rather than tolerate ambiguity, meaning when something unexpected happens, your mind fills in causes, intentions, and meanings, even when there is no evidence, because not knowing feels more threatening than being wrong. This is where beliefs are born, because once your brain explains something in a way that reduces uncertainty, it becomes attached to that explanation. And from that moment on, your perception begins bending to protect the belief rather than challenge it, filtering out contradictory information and highlighting anything that confirms what you already think is true. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing loop, because what you believe shapes what you notice. What you notice shapes how you interpret events, and those interpretations strengthen the belief, slowly turning assumptions into convictions that feel obvious and unquestionable. Your brain prefers coherence over accuracy, meaning it would rather maintain a consistent story than update its model of reality, because updating requires energy, discomfort, and the admission that previous interpretations were incomplete or wrong, which threatens your sense of stability and identity. This is why people defend beliefs that hurt them, because those beliefs organize their reality, and dismantling them would require facing uncertainty, responsibility, and emotional exposure that feels far more dangerous than staying trapped in a familiar mental framework. What you experience as personality is partly the result of these perceptual habits, because your brain learns which interpretations feel safe, which reactions reduce discomfort, and which narratives preserve your sense of control, gradually shaping how you respond to life without conscious intention. Your past plays a powerful role in this construction process, because memories are not stored as fixed recordings, but as flexible reconstructions that change every time you recall them. meaning each memory is influenced by your current emotional state and beliefs, subtly rewriting your past to match your present worldview. This means your brain is not only creating your present reality, but constantly editing your past to support it, reinforcing narratives about who you are, what you deserve, and what is possible for you, even when those narratives are limiting or inaccurate. What makes this especially dangerous is that trauma, rejection, and failure leave strong emotional imprints that bias perception toward threat, causing your brain to over-detect danger in neutral situations and interpret ambiguity as risk, which narrows your reality without you noticing it happening. Once this happens, opportunities begin to look like threats. Silence looks like rejection. Neutrality looks like hostility. And uncertainty looks like failure. Because your brain is prioritizing protection over possibility. Your attention plays a critical role in this process, because whatever you consistently focus on becomes more real to your brain, strengthening the neural pathways associated with those interpretations, while everything else fades into the background, shaping your reality through repetition rather than truth. This is why constantly consuming fear-based information makes the world feel dangerous, why focusing on lack makes life feel scarce, and why focusing on comparison makes your own progress feel invisible. Because attention trains perception, and perception trains belief. What you repeatedly tell yourself becomes the lens through which your brain predicts reality. Because internal dialogue is not just commentary, but instruction, teaching your mind what to expect, what to avoid, and how to interpret experience before it even unfolds. Over time, these internal predictions solidify into a mental environment that feels external, making it seem as though life itself is hostile, unfair, overwhelming, or disappointing. When in reality, those qualities are emerging from the way your brain has learned to frame experience. The most unsettling realization is that you rarely question this internal world, because it feels natural, automatic, and self-evident, even though it is constructed, biased, and incomplete. You do not see reality as it is. You see reality as your brain expects it to be. And unless those expectations are examined, they continue shaping your emotions, decisions, and outcomes while remaining invisible. This is why two people can live in the same circumstances and experience entirely different lives. Because the quality of their reality is not determined by events alone, but by the interpretations their brains generate moment by moment. And this is only the beginning. Because once you understand that your brain is not a passive observer, but an active creator, the next question becomes far more unsettling. If your reality is constructed, who or what has been influencing the instructions your brain has been following all along? What becomes unsettling at this stage is realizing that once your brain has selected its version of reality, it begins defending it automatically, filtering out information that contradicts it and amplifying anything that confirms it. Because the brain prioritizes coherence over truth, meaning it would rather maintain a familiar story than update its beliefs, even if those beliefs are quietly harming you. This is why two people can live through the same experience and walk away with entirely different interpretations, because their brains are not recording reality like cameras, but reconstructing it like storytellers, selecting details that match their existing emotional patterns, memories, and expectations, while discarding anything that feels unfamiliar or threatening to their identity. Your brain does this because uncertainty is psychologically expensive, and a stable narrative, no matter how inaccurate, feels safer than ambiguity, which is why the mind clings to labels, explanations, and assumptions, even when evidence suggests they are incomplete or wrong. Over time, these mental shortcuts become habits, and those habits become lenses through which you interpret every interaction, opportunity, and setback, meaning you stop responding to life as it is and start reacting to life as you expect it to be. This expectation-driven perception is why your brain can create self-fulfilling realities. Because when you expect rejection, your body language tightens, your tone shifts, your behavior becomes guarded, and people respond to that energy, reinforcing the belief that rejection is inevitable. The same mechanism applies to confidence, fear, trust, and success. Because when your brain predicts an outcome, it subtly adjusts your behavior to align with that prediction, making the imagined future feel real before it ever happens. What makes this process invisible is that your brain experiences its interpretations as facts, not opinions, meaning the thought, "people don't respect me," feels no different neurologically than an objective observation, even though it is filtered through past experiences and emotional conditioning. This is why emotional memories are so powerful, because they shape perception faster than logic, allowing past pain to override present evidence. And once that happens, your brain treats the present moment as if it were still under threat. Your nervous system plays a critical role here, because when it is activated by stress or fear, your perception narrows. Your attention focuses on potential danger, and neutral events begin to feel negative, hostile, or meaningful, even when they are not. This narrowing is what causes overthinking, because the brain scans relentlessly for patterns, meanings, and signals, trying to predict outcomes in order to regain a sense of control, even though this constant scanning often increases anxiety rather than reducing it. The brain is not designed to seek happiness first, but safety first, which means it prioritizes detecting threats over noticing opportunities. And this bias can make life feel heavier, harsher, and more uncertain than it actually is. What deepens this effect is repetition, because the more often your brain tells a story, the stronger the neural pathways become. And over time, these pathways activate automatically, making certain interpretations feel immediate and unquestionable. This is how limiting beliefs form, because a belief is not just a thought, but a thought that has been reinforced emotionally and neurologically, turning interpretation into identity. Once identity is involved, perception becomes even more rigid, because changing your interpretation would require changing how you see yourself, and the brain resists that kind of disruption even when it would lead to growth. This is why people often defend beliefs that hurt them, because abandoning them would create psychological instability, forcing the brain to rebuild its internal map of reality from scratch. Another layer of distortion appears through language, because the words you use internally shape how your brain categorizes experiences, meaning labeling a mistake as failure creates a different reality than labeling it as feedback, even if the external event is identical. Your brain responds to these labels emotionally, triggering shame, motivation, fear, or curiosity, based entirely on interpretation, not circumstance. This is why two people can face the same obstacle and experience completely different emotional realities, because the brain is reacting to meaning, not events. The media you consume further strengthens this process, because repeated narratives train your brain to expect certain outcomes, shaping perception before you ever encounter real-world situations. This is why exposure to fear-based, outrage-driven, or pessimistic content can make the world feel more dangerous than it is, because your brain begins scanning for confirmation of those narratives everywhere you go. Your brain cannot distinguish between imagined threats and real ones, which means persistent negative thinking activates the same stress responses as actual danger, slowly exhausting your nervous system. This exhaustion reduces cognitive flexibility, making it harder to challenge assumptions, consider alternative perspectives, or update beliefs, which locks you into a reality shaped by fear rather than possibility. At this point, reality feels fixed, because the brain has stopped exploring and started defending, treating growth as risk and familiarity as safety. What most people never realize is that this process is reversible, not through force or positive thinking, but through awareness and intentional interruption of automatic patterns. When you notice a thought as an interpretation rather than a fact, you create distance between stimulus and response, giving your brain space to choose a different meaning. This space is where perception begins to loosen, because the brain is no longer reacting purely from memory, but engaging with the present moment. As this happens, new neural pathways form, slowly weakening old ones, allowing reality to feel less predictable, less threatening, and more open. This is not instant because the brain resists change at first, interpreting uncertainty as danger. But with repetition, new interpretations begin to feel natural. Over time, your emotional responses soften because your nervous system no longer treats every situation as a reenactment of the past. What emerges is not a new reality, but a clearer one, because you begin seeing situations as they are, rather than as your conditioning predicts them to be. This clarity does not remove pain, failure, or challenge, but it prevents them from defining your identity, because you recognize them as experiences rather than truths. And this is the turning point, because once you realize your brain is creating a version of reality rather than recording it, you gain the ability to participate consciously in that process instead of being controlled by it. What finally becomes impossible to ignore is that once you understand your brain is not revealing reality but constructing it, you also realize that changing your reality does not start with changing the world, but with changing the patterns your mind uses to interpret it, because every belief you hold acts like a lens that bends experience in a specific direction, long before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. Your brain constantly predicts what will happen next based on past experiences, meaning it does not wait for reality to arrive before reacting, because it fills in the gaps using memory, expectation, and emotion. And this predictive process is so fast and automatic that what you experience as the present moment is actually a mental simulation shaped by what your brain expects to see. This is why two people can live in the same environment, face the same events, hear the same words, and walk away with completely different realities, because they are not responding to the world itself, but to the internal models their brains have built to explain it. Once these internal models are reinforced through repetition, the brain begins treating them as truth, filtering out information that contradicts them while amplifying anything that confirms them, creating a closed loop where perception feeds belief and belief feeds perception, until reality feels fixed, even though it is constantly being edited. This is the hidden reason why change feels so difficult, because your brain resists information that threatens its existing model of the world, not because the information is false, but because updating the model requires energy, uncertainty, and emotional discomfort, all of which the brain is designed to avoid. When you attempt to change your life without changing these internal filters, your brain unconsciously sabotages you by drawing your attention back to familiar patterns, familiar people, familiar emotions, and familiar interpretations, making progress feel unnatural and regression feel comfortable. What most people mistake for fate, bad luck, or personality is often nothing more than a repeated perception loop, where the brain keeps recreating the same reality because it does not know how to interpret anything else safely. This explains why trauma reshapes reality so powerfully, because when the brain experiences intense emotional pain, it updates its model aggressively, marking certain situations, behaviors, or emotions as dangerous. And from that point forward, perception becomes biased toward threat detection, even in neutral environments. As a result, the world begins to feel hostile, unpredictable, or unsafe. Not because it objectively is, but because the brain is scanning constantly for confirmation of danger. And when it finds it, the model is reinforced even further. The same mechanism applies to success, confidence, and fulfillment. Because when the brain experiences repeated evidence of capability or safety, it updates its predictions in the opposite direction, making opportunity feel visible, effort feel worthwhile, and uncertainty feel survivable. This is why people who believe they are capable tend to notice chances others miss, because their brains are not filtering those opportunities out as irrelevant or threatening, allowing them to see possibilities that technically existed for everyone all along. Your brain does not ask whether a belief is true, only whether it has been repeated enough to be useful for prediction, which is why beliefs formed in childhood, moments of shame, rejection, or failure, often persist into adulthood, even when they no longer serve you. Once a belief is embedded deeply enough, your brain begins organizing reality around it automatically, influencing your tone, posture, decisions, and reactions in subtle ways that signal the belief outward, causing others to respond in ways that reinforce it. This is how self-fulfilling realities are born, because perception shapes behavior, behavior shapes response, and response shapes evidence, locking the brain into a loop that feels external but is internally generated. Breaking this loop does not begin with positive thinking, because the brain does not respond to words but to patterns, repetition, and emotional experience. Meaning real change requires exposing the brain to new evidence consistently enough that it is forced to update its predictions. This is why discomfort is unavoidable during transformation, because the brain interprets new patterns as uncertainty, and uncertainty activates fear responses designed to pull you back toward the familiar, even when the familiar is limiting or painful. What feels like resistance, procrastination, or self-doubt is often the brain attempting to preserve its existing model, because a predictable negative reality feels safer than an unpredictable positive one. The moment you recognize this, you stop treating fear as a signal to stop and start seeing it as a signal that your brain is encountering information it has not yet learned how to process safely. This awareness alone begins to loosen the grip of old realities, because instead of believing every thought and emotion as truth, you start observing them as outputs of a system that can be trained, reshaped, and refined. Your attention becomes the most powerful tool in this process, because what you focus on repeatedly tells your brain what matters, what is dangerous, and what is worth predicting. Meaning attention is not passive, but instructional. When you repeatedly direct attention toward growth, agency, and possibility, even when it feels unnatural, the brain begins slowly updating its model, because it has no choice but to adapt to the information it is consistently fed. Over time, this adaptation becomes automatic, and what once felt forced begins to feel natural, not because the world changed, but because the filter through which you experience it did. This is the point, where reality begins to feel different, even though the external conditions may be similar, because your brain is now constructing a new version of the world based on updated expectations rather than outdated fears. What you finally understand is that you have never been trapped by circumstances alone, but by interpretations that felt invisible because they operated beneath conscious awareness. The most unsettling and empowering truth is that your reality has always been flexible, but only to the degree that your brain was willing to revise its predictions. Once you accept that your experience of life is something your brain actively creates, rather than something that simply happens to you, responsibility shifts from control to awareness, and with that shift comes freedom. You stop trying to force outcomes and start training perception, knowing that when perception changes, choices change, behavior changes, and outcomes follow naturally. This is not about denying pain, struggle, or uncertainty, but about recognizing that your brain decides how much space they occupy, how long they last, and what meaning they carry. And when you realize that your brain has been quietly shaping your reality every moment of your life, the final and most powerful realization emerges, which is that by changing how your mind interprets the world, you are not escaping reality at all, but finally seeing how much influence you have had over it all along. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.